If you were to open your wallet right now and pull out any denomination of American currency, you would find a very specific pantheon of faces staring back at you. Washington, Jefferson, Hamilton, Franklin. These are the men we are universally taught to credit with the architectural creation of the United States. We memorize their speeches, we debate their philosophies, and we treat their faces on our modern fiat currency as the ultimate historical reward for building a nation. But the man who actually paid for that nation, the man who personally bankrolled the survival of the Continental Army and engineered the very financial architecture that allows the modern American economy to function, is nowhere to be found. His name was Robert Morris. He was a founding father who wielded more sheer economic power than any American in history, operating as a clandestine central bank before the concept even existed in the colonies. He orchestrated the secret global supply chains that kept George Washington's soldiers from starving, personally signed the financial instruments that kept the revolution from collapsing into insolvency, and introduced the foundational concepts of national credit and private banking to a chaotic new world. Yet after buying a country its independence, this financial titan ended his days rotting in a debtor's prison, entirely forgotten by the government he had single-handedly kept afloat. How does a man who fundamentally designed the financial mechanisms of a new empire rise to such unprecedented monopolistic power only to lose everything? To understand the tragic, hidden legacy of Robert Morris, we have to look past the battlefield heroics of the American Revolution and look instead at the brutal, unromantic ledger books of 18th century global trade. We have to understand what it meant to build a financial empire in a world that had no standard currency, no digital wire transfers, no credit bureaus, and no safety nets. Before the United States Treasury existed, before the Federal Reserve digitized the money supply, colonial America was an economic backwater deliberately starved of capital. Under the British mercantile system, the American colonies were designed to be a massive resource extraction engine. The rules were engineered to keep the colonists economically dependent on London. They were expected to harvest raw materials like tobacco, timber, and indigo, ship them exclusively to British ports, and buy back manufactured goods at a premium. More importantly, the colonies were chronically, intentionally deprived of hard currency. British sterling was kept fiercely guarded across the Atlantic. In this environment, doing business was an absolute nightmare of localized chaos. If you were a merchant in the 1750s, you didn't have a checking account or a corporate credit card. You navigated a fragmented, localized barter economy, swimming in Spanish pieces of 8, Dutch guilders, tobacco warehouse receipts, and highly volatile colonial paper money that might be completely worthless the moment you crossed a provincial border. Into this unforgiving economic wilderness arrived a 13-year-old boy from Liverpool in 1747. Robert Morris did not come from aristocratic wealth. His father was an iron exporter working out of Maryland, who soon sent his son to Philadelphia for a brief formal education before securing him an apprenticeship in the counting house of Charles Willing. At the time, Willing was one of the most powerful merchants in Philadelphia, and his counting house was the nerve center of international trade. To a modern observer, a colonial counting house might look like a simple room full of clerks scratching away with quill pens. In reality, it was an 18th century intelligence agency and a high-stakes commodities trading floor rolled into one. Information was the ultimate currency. A merchant's survival depended on knowing which European ports were blocked by war, where crops had failed, which shipping lanes were swarming with privateers, and exactly whom you could trust with a line of credit spanning thousands of miles of ocean. Young Robert Morris possessed a terrifyingly brilliant mind for this exact calculus of risk. He understood instinctively that in a world without instantaneous communication, trade was entirely reliant on reputation and the delicate architecture of paper credit. Sending a wooden ship across the Atlantic was the 18th century equivalent of an aggressive venture capital investment. Highly leveraged, exposed to catastrophic risk, and reliant on asymmetric information. Morris absorbed the mechanics of maritime insurance, currency arbitrage, and international supply chains with such ferocious competence that by the age of 20, following Charles Willing's death, he was made a full partner by Willing's son, Thomas. The firm of Willing, Morris and Company rapidly expanded, sending its ships to the Caribbean, to Europe, and into the murky, highly profitable waters of international smuggling. They had to smuggle. The British Navigation Act strictly limited who the colonists could trade with, effectively acting as an invisible tax on all colonial enterprise. By heavily engaging in the gray markets of the Caribbean, trading flour and lumber for sugar and molasses outside the watchful eyes of British customs agents, Morris learned how to move vast amounts of capital and cargo completely under the radar. He was building a clandestine logistical network that, unbeknownst to him, would eventually become the lifeline of a desperate revolution. By the 1760s, Willing, Morris and Company was an economic juggernaut. Robert Morris was wildly wealthy, highly respected, and deeply pragmatic. He was not a fiery, ideological radical like Samuel Adams. He was a man of ledgers and balance sheets. When the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act in 1765, demanding that all legal documents, newspapers, and commercial contracts in the colonies be printed on stamped paper purchased with British sterling, the ideological patriots saw an assault on liberty. Morris saw a catastrophic liquidity crisis. The requirement to pay the tax in hard silver, which the colonies physically did not have, threatened to grind the entire colonial economy to a halt. It was an impossible demand that would trigger mass defaults. Morris's response was not to riot in the streets, but to weaponize his economic leverage. He joined the Non-Importation Agreement, organizing merchants to boycott British goods. It was a calculated pressure point tactic designed to hurt British manufacturers so badly that they would lobby Parliament to repeal the tax. And it worked. But the tensions continued to escalate. The Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, the closing of the port of Boston. With every punitive measure passed by London, the colonial economy suffered. Morris watched with mounting dread as the situation deteriorated toward open conflict. He initially opposed declaring independence, not out of loyalty to the crown, but because he understood, better than almost any man alive, the sheer, staggering mathematics of war. War is not just a contest of ideologies or battlefield tactics. War is an infinitely hungry machine that consumes capital, logistics, and supply chains at an exponential rate. When the shots were finally fired at Lexington and Concord in the spring of 1775, and the Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia to build an army, they faced a stark, terrifying reality. They had declared war against the greatest military and financial empire on earth. Yet the newly minted American government had zero authority to levy taxes. They had no standardized currency. They had no domestic manufacturing base capable of producing muskets, cannons, or gunpowder at scale. And they had absolutely no credit history to secure loans from European powers. The Continental Congress was rich in rhetoric, but functionally bankrupt. They had tens of thousands of farmers and tradesmen taking up arms, and absolutely no mechanism to pay them, clothe them, or arm them. Congress's initial solution was to simply print paper money, the continental currency, backed by nothing but the vague promise of future tax revenues from colonies that were not legally obligated to pay. Morris knew exactly what would happen. Without a mechanism to absorb the printed money, without gold or silver reserves to back it, the continental currency was destined to hyperinflate into absolute worthlessness. The revolution was mathematically doomed before it even began. The fledgling government needed guns, saltpeter, uniforms, and ships. They needed to bypass the greatest naval blockade in human history, and most importantly, they needed someone whose personal signature, whose individual reputation, carried enough weight in the banking houses of Europe to actually buy these things on credit. The ideological founders quickly realized that their grand experiment in liberty was entirely dependent on cold, hard logistics. They turned to the one man in America who had the network, the capital, and the sheer audacity to run a shadow economy capable of funding a continental war. Robert Morris was appointed to the Secret Committee of Trade. The pragmatic merchant who had spent his life calculating risk in the counting houses of Philadelphia was about to leverage his entire global empire and his personal fortune on the most dangerous, highly leveraged gamble in modern history. When the Continental Congress appointed Robert Morris to the Secret Committee of Trade in late 1775, they were essentially outsourcing the survival of the American Revolution to a private corporation. The newly formed government possessed no diplomatic standing, no institutional credit, and no treasury. If George Washington's freezing, under-equipped troops outside Boston were going to receive gunpowder, muskets, and uniforms, those supplies had to be purchased on the black market of global trade, using the very European supply chains that Morris had spent 2 decades mastering. To understand how Morris executed this, one must look at the highly controversial mechanics of his operation. Morris did not merely advise Congress on trade, he became the primary contractor for the war effort, deliberately and inextricably blurring the lines between the public ledger of the United States and the private balance sheets of Willing Morris and Company. The strategy was a massive, high-stakes arbitrage operation. Congress would authorize funds, often just highly inflationary paper continentals, which Morris would use to purchase American agricultural commodities like tobacco, flour, and indigo. He would load these goods onto his own private merchant vessels, paying his firm a commission, and send them braving through the tightening dragnet of the British Royal Navy. The destination was rarely Europe directly, but rather the neutral Caribbean ports of St. Eustatius or Martinique. There the commodities were quietly exchanged for French and Spanish munitions, which were then smuggled back to the American coast. It was an unimaginably dangerous logistical loop. Every ship that sailed was a target for British men of war and privateers. If caught, the cargo was seized, the ships burned, and the crews imprisoned. But because the United States had no established credit history, the European merchants supplying the weapons refused to accept the word of the Continental Congress. They demanded the personal signature and financial guarantee of Robert Morris. His private reputation was the only collateral the revolution had. This clandestine network soon expanded into one of the most remarkable covert intelligence and smuggling operations of the 18th century. By the spring of 1776, Morris was coordinating with Silas Deane, an American envoy dispatched to Paris. Together with the celebrated French playwright and spy, Pierre-Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais, author of The Barber of Seville, they established a front company called Rodrigue Hortalez and Company. On paper, it was a private Spanish trading firm. In reality, it was a money laundering vehicle backed by the French and Spanish crowns, designed to funnel millions of livres worth of covert military aid to the Americans without provoking an open declaration of war from Great Britain. Morris was the American anchor of this pipeline, organizing the distribution of smuggled French cannon, tents, and gunpowder that would ultimately sustain the Continental Army through its most desperate early campaigns. Yet despite effectively running the war's logistics, Morris remained deeply conflicted about the political trajectory of the rebellion. In July of 1776, as the Continental Congress debated the formal Declaration of Independence, Morris forcefully argued for delay. He was not a royalist, he was a pragmatist staring at a catastrophic balance sheet. He understood that declaring formal independence would sever all remaining legal trade ties with the British Empire. triggering an economic shockwave the colonies were entirely unprepared to absorb. On July 2, 1776, when the decisive vote on independence was taken, Morris and his partner John Dickinson intentionally absented themselves from the Pennsylvania delegation, allowing the measure to pass without their opposition. However, once the die was cast, Morris did something that separated him from mere profiteers. In August, he returned to the Pennsylvania State House and affixed his signature to the Declaration of Independence. By doing so, he committed high treason against the Crown, guaranteeing that if the revolution failed, he would not only lose his vast commercial empire, but he would hang from a British rope. The true test of that commitment arrived mere months later, during the darkest psychological and logistical crisis of the entire war. By December 1776, the American rebellion was effectively collapsing. George Washington's army had been routed in New York, chased relentlessly across New Jersey, and was now huddled, freezing and demoralized, on the western banks of the Delaware River in Pennsylvania. The troops were starving, diseased, and largely without shoes. Worse, the enlistment terms for the vast majority of the soldiers were set to expire at midnight on December 31st. Without a miraculous intervention, the Continental Army would legally dissolve in a matter of days. Panic seized Philadelphia. Fearing an imminent British occupation, the Continental Congress fled the city in terror, relocating to Baltimore. But they left one man behind. They appointed Robert Morris to remain in Philadelphia, granting him sweeping, unprecedented authority to act as a one-man executive branch and de facto dictator of American finance. Washington sent a frantic, desperate dispatch to Morris. He intended to launch a highly risky surprise offensive across the icy Delaware River to attack the Hessian garrison at Trenton. But to keep his men from walking away on New Year's Day, rhetoric and patriotism were no longer sufficient. Washington needed hard currency. He needed a cash bounty to offer his men, and he needed it instantly. The problem was that the paper Continental dollar was already in a state of rapid depreciation, and Washington's soldiers refused to accept it. They demanded hard specie, actual silver and gold coins. The Continental treasury was empty. In the frigid, waning days of December, Robert Morris hit the cobblestone streets of Philadelphia. He called in every personal favor, knocked on the doors of wealthy Quaker merchants, and leveraged his own unblemished credit to borrow cash. He personally guaranteed the loans against his own immense private fortune. Through sheer force of will and mercantile reputation, Morris scraped together $50,000 in hard silver and gold, an astronomical sum for a paralyzed city in the middle of a military evacuation. On the morning of December 30th, 1776, Morris dispatched the chest of hard currency to Washington's camp. It arrived just in time. The sight of actual silver convinced the desperate soldiers to extend their enlistments for another 6 weeks. That financial injection allowed Washington to hold his army together long enough to execute the crossing of the Delaware, secure the victories at Trenton and Princeton, and fundamentally alter the psychological momentum of the American Revolution. Without Robert Morris's personal credit, there would have been no army. Without the army, the revolution dies on the banks of the Delaware in the winter of 1776. But military miracles cannot solve structural economic catastrophes. The victories at Trenton and Princeton bought the revolution time, but they did not fix the underlying mathematics. As the war ground on into 1777 and 1778, the Continental Congress, possessing no power of taxation, continued to fund the war through the only mechanism it had, the printing press. They printed millions of unbacked paper Continental dollars. The result was one of the most devastating hyperinflationary spirals in history. Prices for basic goods doubled, then tripled, then skyrocketed exponentially. The phrase, "not worth a Continental," became deeply embedded in the American lexicon. This financial collapse manifested in horrific human suffering. most famously at Valley Forge in the winter of 1777 to 1778. The tragedy of Valley Forge was not a crisis of scarcity, it was a crisis of currency. The Pennsylvania countryside surrounding Washington's encampment was actually rich with grain, cattle, and supplies. But local farmers flatly refused to sell their goods to the Continental Army in exchange for worthless paper money. Instead, many chose to smuggle their crops into occupied Philadelphia to sell to the British Army, who paid in gleaming gold and silver sterling. The American soldiers freezing and starving at Valley Forge were the direct victims of a failed monetary policy. The ad hoc supply chains Morris had built were snapping under the weight of a worthless national currency. During this period, Morris's strategy of mingling public funds with his private enterprise began to draw intense, venomous scrutiny. Ideological purists in Congress, alongside prominent pamphleteers like Thomas Paine, accused Morris of rampant war profiteering. They pointed out, not incorrectly, that Willing Morris and Company was extracting massive commissions from government contracts while the public economy burned. Morris countered that without his firm's infrastructure, the government could not move a single barrel of flour, and that he was absorbing massive maritime losses from British captures. In 1779, Congress launched a formal investigation into Morris's ledgers. He was ultimately cleared of outright fraud, and historians still debate the exact margins of his profits during this era, but the reputational damage was done. The tension between the ideological architects of liberty and the pragmatic engineers of finance had fully fractured. Exhausted, publicly maligned, and deeply frustrated by the systemic incompetence of Congress, Morris resigned from the legislature and stepped back from his leadership roles. But the American economy was not done collapsing. By the spring of 1780, the United States was facing total institutional failure. The British captured Charleston, South Carolina, taking thousands of American troops prisoner in the worst military defeat of the war. The Continental dollar officially died, trading at a ratio of 40-1 against silver before ceasing to circulate entirely. Mutinies erupted in the Pennsylvania and New Jersey lines, not over ideology, but over years of unpaid back wages and lack of food. The government was functionally insolvent, unable to borrow a single shilling domestically or abroad. The piecemeal system of secret committees and merchant smuggling had reached its absolute limit. Relying on the private credit of individual merchants was no longer enough to sustain a multi-year continental conflict against an empire. The United States didn't just need a supply officer, it needed a centralized financial architecture. It needed taxation, it needed an organized national debt, and it needed a modern bank. Staring into the abyss of total military and economic defeat, a terrified Congress realized they had to surrender control. They could no longer manage the war by committee. They needed an executive. In 1781, they created a new, extraordinarily powerful position, the Superintendent of Finance. And there was only one man in the entire country with the ruthless competence, the global connections, and the terrifying ambition to wield that kind of power. When the Continental Congress unanimously appointed Robert Morris as Superintendent of Finance in February of 1781, they were essentially handing the entire sovereign economy of the United States to a single private citizen. He was not a Treasury Secretary in the modern sense. There was no treasury to secrete. Instead, Morris became an economic autocrat, granted sweeping, nearly dictatorial powers over the nation's finances, military procurement, and maritime logistics. He accepted the position only after extracting unprecedented concessions from Congress: the absolute power to hire and fire his own personnel, the authority to negotiate directly with foreign powers, and most crucially, the right to continue operating his private commercial empire while holding public office. It was a staggering conflict of interest by modern standards, but in the desperate spring of 1781, Congress had no leverage. They were bankrupt, and Morris was the only entity solvent enough to keep the army in the field. Morris's immediate objective was brutally simple: stop the bleeding. The hyperinflation of the Continental dollar had shattered all faith in paper money. He immediately ceased the printing of the worthless currency and pivoted the American economy toward hard specie, gold and silver. To achieve this, he essentially replaced the credit of the United States with the credit of Robert Morris. He began issuing his own private notes, which became known as Morris notes. These were personal promissory notes signed by Morris himself, guaranteeing payment in hard silver out of his own vaults or through his vast network of European creditors. Astoundingly, the merchants and farmers of America, who had violently rejected the official currency of Congress, accepted the Morris notes. They trusted the signature of the Liverpool-born merchant more than the seal of the United States government. For a brief, critical window, Robert Morris literally became the central bank of the nation, stabilizing the supply chains simply by lending his name to the crisis. But Morris understood that personal credit was merely a tourniquet. A sovereign nation required a permanent financial architecture, a mechanism to centralize its debts and generate institutional credibility. He looked to the Bank of England, the very institution that funded the empire America was trying to destroy, and realized the United States needed a similar engine of state power. In May of 1781, Morris submitted a sweeping plan to Congress to create the Bank of North America. It was a revolutionary proposal. Prior to this moment, there was no commercial banking industry in the 13 colonies. The Bank of North America was designed to be the nation's first chartered, modern commercial bank. The mechanics of the bank were ingenious and highly controversial. It was to be a private institution, capitalized by private investors who purchased stock, but it would serve as the official depository for all government funds and the primary engine for government loans. Morris envisioned the bank issuing paper currency that was strictly convertible to gold and silver on demand, thereby reintroducing a stable circulating medium to the frozen economy. To fund the initial capitalization, Morris utilized a massive loan of silver recently secured from France, shipped across the Atlantic and dragged by ox cart into the vaults in Philadelphia. He then leveraged this silver to issue banknotes worth multiples of the actual reserve, introducing fractional reserve banking to the United States. It was an audacious financial tightrope walk, but it worked. The Bank of North America provided the vital liquidity necessary to revive the paralyzed commercial arteries of the nation. However, the political backlash was immediate and visceral. The ideological purists, particularly the agrarian factions led by men like Thomas Jefferson, viewed the bank with deep suspicion. To them, it represented the very centralized, aristocratic financial power they were fighting a war to escape. They saw Morris engineering a system where wealthy Eastern merchants and bondholders would dictate terms to indebted farmers. The profound tension between agrarian democracy and centralized financial capitalism, a tension that defines American politics to this day, was born in the fierce debates over Morris's bank. Yet, while the politicians debated theory, Morris was fighting an urgent, terrifying reality in the field. By the summer of 1781, the war had reached its strategic climax. Lord Charles Cornwallis had marched a massive British army into Virginia, ultimately entrenching himself at the port of Yorktown. George Washington, positioned in New York, saw an unprecedented opportunity to march his combined American and French forces south and trap Cornwallis against the sea, provided the French Navy could blockade the Chesapeake Bay. It was the military maneuver that could end the war. But moving a massive army 400 miles down the eastern seaboard required a staggering logistical apparatus. Washington needed thousands of barrels of flour, herds of cattle, wagons, horses, and most importantly, he needed to pay his mutinous troops, who were once again on the verge of armed revolt due to lack of wages. Washington turned to the superintendent of finance. The message was clear: Fund the march, or the opportunity is lost. Morris was entirely out of government funds. The states had refused his desperate pleas for tax revenues. So, Morris executed the greatest financial high-wire act of his career. He issued a torrent of new personal notes, risking total personal bankruptcy if the campaign failed. He ruthlessly leveraged his private commercial network, demanding his agents scour the mid-Atlantic for grain and meat. When the French commander, the Comte de Rochambeau, refused to march his troops further without hard currency, Morris negotiated a massive emergency loan directly from the French military chest, personally guaranteeing its repayment. When Washington's own troops demanded 1 month's pay in hard silver before crossing the Delaware River into Maryland, Morris literally stood on the docks of Philadelphia, physically taking possession of a shipment of French silver coins and rushed them to the army. Morris engineered the entire logistical train that fed, moved, and paid the Allied army on its march south. The siege of Yorktown in October 1781 is remembered for the thunder of French siege guns and the bayonet charges of Alexander Hamilton. But the operation was entirely underwritten by the frenetic ledger books and terrifying personal financial exposure of Robert Morris. When Cornwallis finally surrendered, effectively securing American independence, the nation celebrated. But Morris knew the truth. The war was won, but the nation was utterly, hopelessly bankrupt. The victory at Yorktown did not solve the fundamental structural crisis of the United States. The Articles of Confederation, the governing document of the new nation, explicitly denied Congress the power to levy taxes. The government could only request funds from the individual states, and the states almost universally ignored these requests. The United States was drowning in tens of millions of dollars of war debt owed to France, Holland, Spain, and domestic soldiers, with absolutely zero income to service it. Morris recognized that a nation that defaults on its debts immediately loses its sovereignty. He aggressively lobbied Congress in the states for a federal impost, a 5% national tariff on imported goods that would provide an independent revenue stream for the federal government. It was the crucial first step toward establishing a true national state. For 3 agonizing years, Morris fought a bitter, grinding political war against the state legislatures, trying to convince them to surrender a sliver of their financial autonomy to save the Union. He argued that a national debt, if properly funded by a reliable tax, could be a powerful, unifying force, a concept his protege, Alexander Hamilton, would later adopt and successfully implement. But the states, fiercely protective of their new independence and deeply suspicious of centralized power, refused. Rhode Island outright vetoed the tariff, and Virginia ultimately withdrew its support. Morris's grand vision for a solvent, fiscally unified American republic was shattered against the wall of state sovereignty. Exhausted, deeply unpopular among the agrarian populace, and disgusted by the political paralysis, Robert Morris resigned as superintendent of finance in late 1784. He left a government still functionally broke, but one that had miraculously survived long enough to secure peace. Freed from public office, Morris turned his terrifying intellect and boundless ambition back to the private sector. He was arguably the wealthiest man in America, and he was about to launch a speculative empire that would dwarf anything he had attempted during the war. He sought to conquer not just global trade, but the very geography of the North American continent. It was a gamble of unprecedented scale, driven by a fatal miscalculation of the very economic forces he had helped unleash. Having engineered the financial survival of the United States, Robert Morris left public office in 1784 and re-entered the world of private speculation as the most powerful and well-connected capitalist in the new nation. He returned to a country he had helped create, a country whose fundamental economic DNA was now intertwined with the very concepts of credit, debt, and banking that he had personally installed. But the political and economic landscape had shifted in ways that Morris, for the first time in his life, critically misjudged. He watched with a mixture of vindication and alarm as the United States under the Articles of Confederation proved to be exactly the dysfunctional, bankrupt entity he had predicted. The inability to tax, to regulate interstate commerce, and to pay the war debts led to economic stagnation, social unrest, and a series of state-level defaults. This culminated in Shays' Rebellion in 1786, an armed uprising of indebted Massachusetts farmers that terrified the propertied classes across the country. The rebellion served as the final, violent proof that Morris had been right all along. The weak, decentralized government was a failure. The crisis spurred the calling of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. Though Morris was not a primary intellectual architect like James Madison, he was a delegate from Pennsylvania and a powerful background presence. He sat quietly, observing his former protege, Alexander Hamilton, forcefully argue for the very system of centralized federal power, national taxation, and assumption of state debts that Morris had championed as superintendent. The new Constitution, with its enumerated powers to tax, to borrow, and to regulate commerce, was the ultimate vindication of Morris's long, bitter war against state insolvency. When George Washington was elected the first president, he immediately offered Morris the most powerful post in his new cabinet, Secretary of the Treasury. It was the position Morris had been born to hold, the institutionalization of the role he had played during the Revolution. In a decision that would prove to be tragically fateful, Morris declined. He told Washington that he was a man of commerce, not politics, and instead recommended the young, brilliant, and ferociously ambitious Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton, as the first Treasury Secretary, immediately set about implementing a perfect, amplified version of the Morris financial program. He federalized the war debts, established a new national bank modeled directly on Morris's Bank of North America, and created the national revenue system Morris had desperately fought for. The Hamiltonian financial system, the very bedrock of American capitalism, was in truth the Morris financial system finally made law. While Hamilton was building the state, Morris was attempting to buy the continent. He believed that the real future of American wealth lay not in the coastal trade of Europe, but in the vast, unexploited lands of the American West. He began to speculate in land on a scale that defies modern comprehension. He formed syndicates and leveraged his international credit to purchase millions of acres across western New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and the newly formed District of Columbia. His strategy was to buy enormous tracts of wilderness at wholesale prices and sell them at retail to the anticipated flood of European immigrants and domestic settlers. It was the same arbitrage logic he had applied to tobacco and munitions during the war, but now the commodity was the American continent itself. For a brief period in the early 1790s, Morris stood at the absolute apex of American finance. He lived in a lavish Philadelphia mansion that was effectively the unofficial residence of the president, hosting Washington, Jefferson, and the elite of the new government. He was building a palatial new home designed by the famed architect Pierre L'Enfant, intended to be a veritable marble palace that would rival the great houses of European aristocracy. He was Robert Morris, the financier of the Revolution, the kingmaker, the man whose personal credit had been more valuable than the national seal. He believed he was too big to fail. This was his fatal error. Morris had built his empire on the architecture of 18th century finance, a world of personal reputation, handshake deals, and long-term credit lines. But the very system he and Hamilton had created was rapidly giving rise to a new, more impersonal and volatile form of capitalism. The new nation was racked by periodic financial panics, credit crunches, and speculative bubbles. The trigger for his collapse came from Europe. The outbreak of the French Revolutionary Wars in the mid-1790s threw global credit markets into chaos. European investors who were supposed to buy Morris's land script pulled back. The flow of immigrants slowed to a trickle. Suddenly, the immense river of credit Morris relied on to service his monumental debts ran dry. He was land-rich but cash-poor, holding title to an empire of trees and rocks that no one wanted to buy. His creditors, who had once lined up to offer him loans, now lined up to demand payment. The notes he had issued, once the most stable currency in the nation, began to be refused. The intricate web of credit he had spun over 3 decades began to unravel with terrifying speed. He desperately tried to liquidate his assets, selling off his art, his furniture, his wine cellar. He abandoned construction on his marble palace, leaving it a hollowed-out shell that became known around Philadelphia as Morris's Folly. Creditors and sheriffs began to circle his mansion, and the man who had once hosted the president in opulent splendor became a prisoner in his own home, afraid to step outside for fear of being arrested for debt. The fall was as swift as it was brutal. In February of 1798, Robert Morris, the former superintendent of finance, the signer of the Declaration, the personal banker of the American Revolution, was arrested and sent to the Prune Street Debtor's Prison in Philadelphia. Debtor's Prison in the 18th century was not a white-collar correctional facility. It was a squalid, disease-ridden pit where the indigent and the unfortunate were thrown together. Morris, now in his 60s and suffering from ill health, found himself sharing a cramped, filthy cell with a collection of common criminals and bankrupt tradesmen. The man who once commanded a fleet of merchant ships and controlled the flow of millions of dollars was now utterly dependent on the charity of his few remaining loyal friends for food and blankets. From his prison cell, he wrote desperate, heartbreaking letters, pleading for release. He watched as the nation he had financed continued to grow and prosper on the foundations he had laid. The Bank of the United States, Hamilton's creation built on Morris's blueprint, thrived. The national credit, established by assuming the very debts Morris had struggled to fund, became the engine of American growth. The winners were the new class of stock jobbers, financiers, and institutional players who understood how to navigate the new, impersonal world of Hamiltonian capitalism. The loser was the system's architect, left to rot in a cage. After 3.5 years of agonizing confinement, Morris was finally released in 1801, thanks to the passage of a new federal bankruptcy law, a law he himself had ironically advocated for years earlier. He emerged a broken and forgotten man. His wife Mary had heroically held on to a small annuity, which allowed them to live out their final years in a modest rented house in Philadelphia, a few blocks from the skeletal remains of his unfinished palace. Robert Morris died in 1806 in quiet obscurity. His death received only a few lines in the local papers. There were no state funerals, no grand monuments, no eulogies from the generation of leaders he had served and saved. His name was quietly scrubbed from the national memory, an inconvenient and embarrassing reminder of the brutal, messy arithmetic that underpins the glorious rhetoric of revolution. The legacy of Robert Morris is a story of profound, tragic irony. He was a man who understood better than anyone that a nation is not just an idea, it is a balance sheet. He introduced the foundational tools of modern capitalism to America: central banking, national debt, and corporate finance, and in doing so created the very system that would ultimately consume him. The central question is not just how one man could rise so high and fall so far, but what his story reveals about the nature of power itself. Morris's life exposes the permanent, often uncomfortable tension between the creators of systems and the inheritors of them. Are the foundational myths of a nation more important than the messy, often morally ambiguous, financial engineering required to make those myths possible? The story of Robert Morris forces us to look past the portraits on our currency and ask a more fundamental question: who actually pays for the architecture of our world? For every celebrated ideological founder, there is an uncelebrated, often invisible, logistical engineer. Morris's forgotten legacy is a testament to the fact that history is not only written by the victors, but also by their accountants. If you believe that understanding these hidden architects is essential to understanding the world we live in today, and that the true story of power is often found in the ledger books rather than the history books, consider subscribing to our channel. There are countless forgotten figures whose stories, like that of Robert Morris, change everything you thought you knew about how our modern world was truly built.